You're holding a bones. It's 6,000 years old. There are marks on it, deliberate cuts made by a stone blade. The cuts follow the joints, the places where ligaments attach. Someone was separating this bone from the rest of the skeleton with precision. But this wasn't a careful butchering of an animal. The bone is human, and based on the pattern of incisions, based on the arrangement of fragments found in the hearth nearby, based on the calcination marks left by prolonged exposure to fire, someone in this settlement didn't just eat another human. They dismembered them with the same methodical care they'd use for any other protein source. No panic, no desperation written into the cutting marks. Just routine. This is where the story of ancient human cannibalism actually begins. Not in sensationalism or moral judgment, but in recognizing that evidence exists, that it's widespread enough to suggest pattern rather than exception, and that understanding why humans engaged in this behavior requires abandoning the myths we've built around it. We tell ourselves that people ate other people only in the most extreme circumstances: starvation, shipwrecks, the absolute margins of human survival. The archaeological record suggests something messier. Cannibalism among ancient populations existed across multiple contexts, motivated by multiple forces, and reveals something fundamental about how humans organize themselves under pressure. It wasn't deviance. For some groups, it was infrastructure. The conventional narrative frames cannibalism as survival of last resort. You're trapped. Everyone's starving. Morality becomes an impossible luxury. You do what you have to do. But when anthropologists and archaeologists started examining the actual evidence, the cut marks on bones, the distribution of remains, the context of settlements where consumption occurred, they found that this story doesn't hold up consistently. Some evidence of cannibalism appears in archaeological contexts where food was relatively abundant. Some appears in rituals that had nothing to do with nutrition. And some appears in patterns that suggest not desperation but hierarchy, not starvation but systematic processing. To understand what was actually happening, you have to move past the assumption that cannibalism is always a breakdown of civilization. Sometimes it was civilization itself. Let's begin with the Neanderthals. We've known for decades that Neanderthal bones show evidence of butchering cut marks consistent with defleshing. Long bones fractured to access marrow. For years, anthropologists explained this as scavenging. Neanderthals, the argument went, were so desperate that they'd even consume their own dead when nothing else was available. But that interpretation started to collapse when researchers began looking more carefully at the pattern of cuts compared to those found on animal bones in the same sites. The defleshing marks on Neanderthal remains were methodical. They followed anatomical logic. They showed evidence of learned technique. The same kind of skill you'd see from someone who'd butchered hundreds of animals and understood exactly where to cut to separate muscle from bone efficiently. This wasn't desperate gnawing on remains. This was practiced work. The site of Moulagursi in France, dating to around 60,000 years ago, revealed remains from at least 6 individuals, 2 adults and 4 children, that had been systematically dismembered. The cut marks indicate that the soft tissues were removed first. Then the bones were fractured to access the marrow. These were the same processing steps you'd use on any hunted game. What matters is the implication. Neanderthals had incorporated human consumption into their existing butchering protocols. The fact that the victims included children complicates the starvation narrative further. If you're genuinely desperate and eating people to survive, you'd prioritize the largest sources of meat, the healthy adults. including children in the consumption, pattern suggests something different. The meal included whoever was available. The processing was routine enough that no one felt the need to handle human remains differently than they'd handle deer or bison. Move forward 50,000 years, and the patterns become even more visible. Early modern human sites across Europe show similar evidence. The Whaling Cave in Spain contained the remains of at least 6 individuals with cut marks and bone fractures consistent with cannibalism, dating to around 28,000 years ago. The Paderborn site in Germany shows similar patterns. What becomes clear when you look at the distribution of these sites is that cannibalism wasn't unusual or rare. It was practiced across multiple populations, over extended periods. If this were genuine survival cannibalism, the product of extreme starvation events, you'd expect it to be localized, temporary, absent from most archaeological contexts. Instead, you find it everywhere. You find it in regions that weren't experiencing famine. You find it in sites where other faunal evidence suggests plenty of game animals were available. The implications shift your entire understanding of what was occurring. Rather than survival behavior, evidence points toward incorporation into existing cultural practice. And more specifically, toward ritual consumption that served social functions. When researchers examined the remains of consumed individuals, they often found that not all parts were eaten. Certain bones were prioritized. The skull sometimes received special treatment, burned in particular ways, decorated, or arranged differently than other remains. Hands and feet were sometimes buried separately. This isn't nutrition. This is ritual. The consumption of human flesh was embedded in a system of meaning, of status, of social communication. Eating another person wasn't something you did because you were starving. It was something you did because it conveyed something about power, about allegiance, about your relationship to the deceased and to the community. Consider a more recent example: the Anasazi communities of the American Southwest. Around the 12th century CE, multiple settlements in what is now Arizona and New Mexico show evidence of mass violence followed by cannibalism. The sites of Cowboy Wash and Palika Wash contain remains of at least 7 individuals in one case and 10 in the other, bearing evidence of scalping, dismemberment, and consumption. The distinctive cut marks appear on the bones. The remains are scattered among food waste and hearths. Crucially, these sites also contain evidence of extreme social stress. Skeletal indicators suggest malnutrition. Iconographic evidence from pottery suggests conflict and violence. Environmental records indicate a region experiencing extended drought. Here, the cannibalism appears in a context of genuine resource scarcity. The populations were struggling, and in that struggle, consumption of other humans became a strategy. But even here, the picture is complex. Not all settlements practiced cannibalism during the drought period. Neighboring communities experienced the same environmental stress, the same nutritional challenges, and yet showed no evidence of consuming their own people. The practice appeared selectively, in particular settlements, under particular leadership structures. This suggests that cannibalism wasn't simply a response to starvation. If it were, you'd see it everywhere in stressed populations. It was a choice made by certain groups, justified within certain cultural frameworks, and used to accomplish certain social goals. Bioarchaeologist Christy Turner Roman II, who conducted extensive research on southwestern cannibalism, argued that evidence points toward ritual warfare and dominance rather than subsistence hunger. The consumed individuals showed signs of prior violence. The consumption occurred in the context of what appears to be conquest. Eating your enemies, consuming the bodies of the defeated, serves as ultimate humiliation and assertion of dominance. The Anasazi evidence might represent not survival cannibalism, but political cannibalism, using the practice to consolidate power and terrorize potential rivals. Across the globe, similar patterns emerge. Easter Island, before European contact, shows evidence of resource collapse that matches the timeline of what we know about the island's deforestation and population pressure. Oral traditions recorded by early European visitors describe periods of famine and warfare. Multiple sources mention that, during these periods, defeated enemies were consumed. The practice was incorporated into warrior culture, into the logic of territorial conquest, into the ritualization of victory. Again, the cannibalism doesn't appear uniformly across the timeline. It's concentrated in particular periods, associated with particular political conflicts, framed within existing cultural systems. Samoa, Fiji, and other Pacific societies show similar patterns cannibalism as embedded in warrior culture. In the processing of defeated enemies, in the consolidation of power through the ultimate violation of the opponent's body. Now here's where interpretation becomes genuinely difficult, and where you have to hold two contradictory observations simultaneously. The archaeological evidence for ancient cannibalism is real. The cut marks are real. The systematic processing is real. But so is our deep psychological resistance to the practice. When we encounter evidence of cannibalism, we're inclined to see it as a sign of depravity, savagery, the ultimate breakdown of human civilization. We want to believe it was aberration rather than pattern. And some of our resistance to accepting the evidence comes from legitimate epistemological concerns. Bones don't come with narratives. Cut marks can result from butchering, from ritual treatment of the dead, from post-mortem exposure that creates patterns similar to deliberate cutting. Fractures attributed to marrow extraction could result from trampling, from scavengers, from simple degradation over thousands of years. When bones are burned, are they burned as part of cooking, or as part of funerary practice? When remains appear commingled with food waste, does that definitively mean they were eaten? Or could they simply have been disposed of near the settlement's waste area? Many researchers have pointed out that interpretations of cannibalism can be influenced by cultural bias. Early European observers of Pacific and African societies were predisposed to see cannibalism as evidence of primitive savagery. Some of those accounts were exaggerated or invented to justify colonization. When modern anthropologists encounter ambiguous bone evidence, might we be unconsciously biased toward the interpretation that confirms pre-existing stereotypes about certain populations? The archaeologist Michael Bisson has argued that some supposed cannibalism evidence is actually interpretive overreach. The cut marks that researchers attribute to human butchering could represent funerary practices, careful preparation of the dead for burial or cremation. The bone fractures could have countless origins. The burned remains could be the result of houses burning down, not cooking practices. The problem is that we can't definitively distinguish between cutting marks made by a human butcher and those made by degradation, scavenging, or intentional post-mortem treatment. Bones are ambiguous evidence, and we're reading narratives into that ambiguity based partly on what we expect to find. But acknowledging this interpretive uncertainty doesn't invalidate the basic conclusion. The sheer accumulation of evidence across multiple sites, multiple time periods, multiple geographic regions suggests that cannibalism wasn't purely a modern invention or a fiction of colonial observers. The pattern is too consistent. The context too varied for a single explanation. And perhaps most tellingly, oral traditions, historical records, and ethnographic accounts from multiple populations consistently mention the practice. Early European observers might have exaggerated or invented some accounts, but they probably didn't invent the entire phenomenon. When Hawaiian oral traditions, recorded long before European contact, describe warrior societies consuming defeated enemies. When Spanish conquistadors encountered the same practice in Aztec ritual contexts. When multiple Polynesian and Melanesian societies maintained oral traditions describing ancestral cannibalism, the convergence of evidence suggests the practice was real, if perhaps sometimes distorted in the retelling. The deeper insight comes when you stop asking whether ancient humans practiced cannibalism and instead ask why. And under what circumstances. Behavior that seems abhorrent to modern sensibilities became integrated into human social systems. The answer reveals something about how humans rationalize and systematize almost anything when survival or dominance is at stake. Cannibalism wasn't psychologically aberrant behavior performed by deranged individuals. It was integrated into broader systems of meaning. Eating your enemy conveyed dominance. Consuming the dead honored their power and incorporated it into your own. Ritual consumption reinforced group membership and allegiance. From the perspective of the societies that practiced it, the behavior made sense. It accomplished identifiable social functions. It was normalized, taught to children, embedded in mythology and religious practice. This doesn't make it less disturbing to modern observers. It makes it more revealing about how human psychology works under pressure. The uncomfortable truth is this: humans can integrate almost any practice into existing social systems if the pressures are sufficient and the justifications are available. We see this across history, not just with cannibalism, but with slavery, with genocide, with systematic torture, with practices so extreme that subsequent generations find them unimaginable. What separates us from our ancestors isn't that they were fundamentally different creatures with alien psychology. It's that our current circumstances don't pressure us toward the same conclusions. You're not going to practice cannibalism in 2026, not primarily because you're more morally evolved, but because you exist within systems of abundance and state enforcement that make the behavior unnecessary and illegal. Your ancestor in a resource-stressed settlement, surrounded by cultural narratives that made the practice meaningful, living under leadership that demanded it as proof of loyalty, probably would have done what was expected. The capacity to integrate even the most disturbing behaviors into normalized social practice is a feature of human psychology, not a bug. And understanding that capacity might be more important than pretending our ancestors were simply savages while we are civilized. The legacy of ancient cannibalism isn't that we should be horrified by our ancestors or grateful we've evolved past such depravity. The legacy is recognition that human behavior is plastic, that practices become normalized through repetition and cultural embedding, and that the distance between ourselves and seemingly unthinkable behavior is smaller than we'd like to believe. When you understand that cannibalism emerged not from breakdown but from system building, that it was practiced not just in survival crises but in contexts of relative stability, that it served clear social functions in the communities that practiced it, you begin to see how humans rationalize almost anything given sufficient pressure and justification. The question worth sitting with isn't what ancient humans did, but why they found it necessary to do it, and whether the systems that made it necessary still exist in different forms today. That's the actual terror of studying our past. It's not how alien it seems, but how familiar.